Okay, so we're looking forward to this topic today. It's actually come about because I've been telling my friends and my sons about what I see coming ahead and just the kind of stuff. And what it was interesting because every time I talk to people, they get excited about this stuff. And I started to realize that people really want to understand this stuff right now, because people right now can see that the system is really becoming problematic and it's heading for some pretty dark, challenging days. Who here is kind of got this sense of a little bit of trepidation where they can see where things are heading after what COVID and what it means for financial things and government kind of controls and new states of emergency? Who's kind of got that worrying them in the back of their mind a little bit, keeping them up at night, or at least it's on your mind a bit? Yeah, so some concerned, a test of compliance, I would agree. Yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, when governments start declaring state of emergencies and taking people's freedoms, that's generally the kind of stuff you read about in history books and the Star Chamber and, in North Korea. I mean, the Star Chamber in the 1600s, you just have to read history and see that that's virtually what happened here, where when government starts saying to you what you can believe of your religion, what you can do, whether you can open your business or not, whether you can work, it's gone a little bit far, and I noticed some of my friends here, hey Frank, and there's quite a few on here today, so that's good. So yeah, it's definitely a time, it's a serious and sobering time when this is going on. So this is really a bit of an introductory on the topic, and and really from there, over the coming weeks, we'll do more of this if people are keen to learn more about this. So let's get started anyway. So obviously, this is not going to, giving you personal advice or anything. You need to go and get that kind of stuff if you need that. So on this stuff in terms of next and what this now means, let's go. So did you know that? Let's just go through this one by one. So I'll be doing two parts to this discussion tonight. One, I'll be briefly sharing on the bullet points I mentioned, and then I'll be sharing 6 what I call useful loopholes you can start with and can start conditioning and training your mind, because really the whole battle is in the mind. It's in the mental realm and understanding that kind of stuff. So the first thing is, if you ever want to really have some fascination, is go and you actually research and you find that the Commonwealth Government is a registered corporation in Washington. And many people are like, what? I mean, the whole thought is just like insane, but there you have it. So if you actually do some research and have a little bit of a look up at that kind of stuff, you will see that for yourself, that the Commonwealth Government is actually completely like a registered corporation. In 2009, it was set up, and yeah, so I'll just even see it. Sometimes it shows it on Google, sometimes it doesn't. So I'll just have a quick look and see if I can find it right now. But yes, if you actually find it, you will see that on the SEC. And so generally you have to go and look into DuckDuckGo or whatever else, or some of the other ones, and you will see it. But yes, basically you will find the Commonwealth of Australia is a registered, basically, entity. Let me have a look. I think I found it here. So yes, if you can see here, like you got Commonwealth of Australia. In fact, you got this filings here. So one filing here, Commonwealth of Australia. But yes, you can go right through. So you'll find it here, various documents and prospectuses and things like that. And here you go. Now people go like, why is the Commonwealth Government? And that's a good question. And really it goes back to understanding that when you're dealing with what's called a new corporate enslavement system, which by and large, the enforcement government arm comes out of Washington, the economic arm comes from a place called the City of London. And when I say City of London, let me just kind of quickly show you something on this one first. I'm going to stop sharing here. I'm going to share my whiteboard and show you something. So when I say City of London, so first you've got the economic arm over here. You've got what I call the religious arm, because generally to enslave or bring people under control, you've really got to control what I call the economic side of things. You've got to control, actually, hang on, let me just get rid of that. So you've got to control the economic side of things. You've got to control the religious side of things. And you've got to control what's called the government type of things or whatever else. So the best way to understand the world order, and like I said, this is something that Took me years to uncover how this all worked, but you got the Washington, DC kind of government with all their little satanic pentagrams and systems, and which by and large, major governments of the world are registered under as corporations. You've got the Vatican over here, which you can, if you look into it, find controls much of the property in many parts of the world, including West Australia, where I live. And then you got this place called the City of London. Now, when I say City of London, and this is something that's very worth looking into this if you haven't discovered this interesting fact yet. But when I say City of London, I'm talking about a very tiny area right in the middle of London. And that's basically what's called a separate government, which is independent from Britain, from the monarchy, everything else. It's basically the City of London, and it's basically run by the Lord Mayor and the banks. It's a very small area in the middle of London. And when the Queen comes in, they have to bow to the Lord Mayor, or the King as we've got now. And basically everything from the legal practice boards to doctors to every medical boards are all ultimately owned and controlled by this City of London, which is these basically banks, this kind of system, which got control of the world in 1666 after the Great Fire of London, when London was ruined. The Rothschilds and various other banks offered to buy in there and take control. And in exchange, they effectively took control of the governments by lending to them, and they've been doing it ever since. So this is what controls the whole world economically. So the whole thing is run like this kind of crazy little system, which I think many are like, wow, you know, and the more you start to uncover this little thing, the more interesting it starts to actually become. So from there, let's just go back to our screen. So we got this Commonwealth of Australia. So that's the first little thing I'll point out to you. So the other thing is here that by and large, originally law, and you've actually got to go back and read the Blackstone's legal commentaries, for example, and you'll actually learn and realize that originally we operate under what's called a common law system, is what we're meant to be, which is a life, liberty, property. So for example, if I rob your bank account or beat you up, that's a violation of law because it affects other fellow man or women. When you got a government saying, oh, you have to do this or pay this amount, the very nature of contract law is by consent. So people consent to be part of a system, or consent to be part of something, or consent to pay taxes, or consent to be in a system. So by and large, we're living in a whole big system of coercion where people are operating under kind of an enforced contract system. At the moment, you get a birth certificate or anything else, you effectively become an item of property commercially belonging to the government of the corporation. And it's been a system that's been set up by centuries, and it goes back to a Khazarian ancient method of conquest. So I'm throwing in a whole other kind of stuff, which you'll have to research yourself or learn more in the coming weeks. But that, like I said, took me years to uncover this. Most of it's hard to find in history books, because once the history books were bought out, they removed a lot of this kind of stuff. But you will actually find that that we're living in a great big commercial enslavement system, but is run by an ancient group called Khazarians, who are one of the most brutal warriors you'll ever come across in your life. And they were known for their brutal methods of conquest of societies using financial control, mortgages, and stuff like that. So basically, it's a system that's designed to coerce and bring people into kind of enslavement. So one of the things that I remember learning years ago, many of you have heard, but most from my experience don't really understand this. And you've got to go back and understand Blackstone's commentaries and original what was called martial law. So when you go back to the original legal system in English common law, for example, the idea was that people should by and large be able to do what they want, and that provided that what they do doesn't affect someone else's life, liberty, or property, then people could do what they want, form the governments they want, form the communities they want. Now, when you go back to the Tower of Babel, which was back about quite a number of thousands of years ago, there was a guy called Nimrod, or Hermes, who basically took control of the world, and rather than let citizens and communities operate freely, started forcing them to come under a universal system, sending in their warriors to conquer them. And so, by and large, in common law, people should be able to do whatever they actually want to do without anyone else telling them what to do, provided what they do doesn't hurt other people. That's the basic idea of doing it. But in fact, as we know very, very well, after what we witnessed in COVID, that governments have basically got enough control of the system that they can coerce people into it. And that is why I can remember when I first learned all this kind of stuff, and I realized this, and I remember the joy I felt when I got out of my first census just using this and actually asking them questions. So rather than just assuming they had authority over me, asking questions very respectfully, doing what I learned from a guy called Howard Friedman, who talks about being sheep among wolves, as the Bible put it. In other words, that you just literally, you don't go in there to fight, but you go in there knowing your authority and knowing that under common law, you submit that provided what you're doing is not hurting anyone else, you can submit to whoever you choose to, just like you can be in relationship with whoever you want to. So I remember asking various questions about the census and who it applied to, and saying, so if I basically wasn't a person in Australia at that time, I don't have to do it. They said, no. I said, great. Because a person is a fictional entity, as you'll learn more about shortly. So in the Blackstone's legal dictionary, for example, a person is a martial law annotation to put people under authority. Now, the reason it's important to understand this is that the one time it was agreed upon in societies when common law rights were suspended is, let's just say that England were under attack from invaders in Spain, like the Armada. The last thing you want is people running around asserting common law rights. You need to get a unified response to fight back and defend your nation. Or let's say Australia was about to be invaded by China. We certainly would want to have some kind of martial law or uniform response. So generally, the idea, as Blackstone explains, was martial law. And the way they distinguished between martial law and common law was by giving people a name in all capital letters, or making sure that the statutes or laws were done in all capital letters. So there was no doubt it was martial law, it was under contract. Blackstone's legal dictionaries, which I read, they've now, the new ones, it's hard to, they've taken it out of there, but the original ones actually said, Blackstone says, woe to a nation who brings in martial law by stealth in times of peace. And I'll say it again. He says, woe to a nation that brings in martial law by stealth in times of peace. And that's what we're dealing with right now. You know, we're dealing with governments that are by and large bringing in martial law in times of peace, which is actually a pretty serious fucking thing, excuse the French. This is not light shit, you know. This is the kind of stuff that you see in the China, the Korea, and various other places. It's something that's serious, it's sobering, and something that response is required from citizens on a fairly large scale to prevent this going pretty bad. So things like, once I worked this all out, I just didn't do censuses. I decided I didn't want to vote anymore for the system while the whole thing was doing this kind of crap. They tried to fine me the first time. I used the power of a pen, as I'll teach you about shortly. They waived the fine. I never heard from them again. I got on with life. So by and large, I remember finding how much the system was voluntary once you find your sovereignty and your power. So ancient law in the book of Deuteronomy, for example, in the Bible, says the borrower is servant to the lender, and says that you're meant to be the head, not the tail. But basically, we're living in a world where we look at banks that have been created by various Rothschilds and other groups with a fictitious money system, and by creating debt traps by greed and consumerism, we remain the bitch and keep working. And by and large, when they decide they want to bring in their lovely little experimental concoctions, that people have to basically do what they're told, or they get defaulted on their debts, lose houses, and lose whatever else. And there's no doubt that the full aftermath of COVID has not yet in any way hit us yet. Notice why one of the things I've been teaching clients for years is to get the fuck out of the rat race really quickly. I was teaching clients years ago to get themselves out of it, stabilize their finances, and not leave themselves vulnerable to governments to force things upon you. So I was very grateful that I had done that when the whole COVID was happening and I could just get on with life. But, you know, by being a little bit, as many at the time used to call me, overly paranoid. One of the things I found, I've even taught my sons and some friends lately, is that I found that most people don't actually know the full story of the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression, many just hear this general thing, and it was a little bit of a this and a little bit of a collapse or whatever else. But what actually happened in the Great Depression, it's quite serious when you actually understand it. In 1928, interest rates started going up, because before then, we had what was called the Roaring Twenties. You know, people were booming, they were buying properties, shares were going up, everyone was rich, everyone was buying this, everyone was buying that. Everyone was running investment seminars and teaching how to be a millionaire in a week and all the kind of crap that we've been seeing today going on. And in 1928, after interest rates were at ridiculous record lows, they started increasing the interest rates to kind of settle things down. And they went up quite exponentially very quickly. Maybe you're starting to see some patterns, some similarities already. By 1929, interest rates had gone up quite a bit to around 10%. And suddenly people were like, oh shit, we can't actually pay our mortgages and we can't pay this. So higher net worth people were like, oh, double shit. And they were starting to slowly sell off their stuff and get out of the markets, whereas the masses continued to run their seminars, continued to do their stuff. And there's an old famous story that Robert Kennedy was in the car and in a taxi, the taxi driver started giving him stock tips. He got back, immediately rang his broker and said, sell all my shares. The day the taxi driver gives me stock tips, we are heading for a collapse. And sure enough, on Black Monday, October 1929, the stock market did an almighty plunge and it continued to go down. And by 1930, they were in the start of the Great Depression. Within the next 3 years, by 1933, most of the banks went broke, and a small number of banks controlled by certain individuals that you may have heard of, like the Morgans, the Rothschilds, and the Rockefellers and others, bought out the banks and took control of the banking. Most healthcare and energetic health, which at the time was quite massive. Water fasting was recommended by many places for healing diabetes, for example. Energy medicine was normal. They were curing cancer by Oxy's clinics doing it. The pharmaceutical companies bought out and set up and forced a regulator to be set up, and they started targeting and driving out alternative health people, including Oxy and many others. The oil barons then drove out the electric car and the water-based, car-based companies already in existence, and yes, that was happening. And technology went into a dark age, which has slowly been starting to come back now. And so we've actually been in a kind of dark age. And my guess is, I'm curious if any one of you know what I've just said. You know, most people I find have no idea and sit there going, what the heck? But we've actually been in a dark age and we're actually coming out of it now. And they can't really stop, for example, the moves to new technologies, but they're making sure that they're buying in. So this is what by and large happened. And by 1933, the economy was in a ruin. Most people's lives were ruined. Most businesses were ruined. And Roosevelt did what he, as he said, had to do at the time. He did a financial reset the currency. And then he proceeded to, after resetting the currency, he then ordered everyone to give up their gold and they'd go to jail for 10 years and sent the army around. Now, considering that humanity tends to repeat their patterns, I think it's fair to say that we're in for some interesting times ahead in the next 3 to 5 years. But if you can't see that, then you're really on the wrong webinar. But my guess is that you all can. So 2007, I spoke at an event at the Hyatt Hotel and I was teaching on this stuff because I'd been involved in underground off-the-grid movements, which I'd come up across in 2001, met former secret agents who'd been very high up in government. And I remember teaching some of this stuff back then. And I actually had a guy tell me, he came with a very prominent international banker. And he told me afterwards, the banker said to him, how the heck does this guy know this stuff? He said, we know this is coming, because back then they weren't doing it. And how does he know this stuff? And of course, I said, well, a mixture of study and things like that. So in other words, back then, they all knew it was coming and getting themselves ready for it. 2018, Porter Stainsbury talked about this. So the coming economic collapse will make the Great Depression look like a family picnic and will cause such widespread economic ruin that the government will say there's no choice, like Roosevelt did in 33, but to reset the currency, bring in the credit system, digital ID, possibly even take people's gold, goodness knows what else. Who knows, they even might have some fun with certain property of non-compliant citizens. So, and at the time, it will seem to be the right choice in the same way that at the time, coercing people into going and getting vaccines seemed to be the logical choice because humanity doesn't learn a lot. So, yeah, this is stuff I've been saying behind the scenes to people for a while, but I just decided, look, I have had this sense that we're heading there and the time is very short now. I don't feel we're far away. And I thought, nah, it's just time to say it. I mean, if a lot of people think I'm an idiot, I really don't give a rat's ass because I know that there's people who are going to listen and there's people who are going to realize that it's very important to take action and start preparing yourself for what's ahead in the same way that squirrels collect nuts and bears hibernate for winters. So one of the most surprising things I found was I remember when I discovered that the income tax was actually a compulsory contribution to simply pay off interest and had nothing to do with social services. And the most incredible thing was I actually saw government documents confirming that the tax office at the time wasn't a legal entity and wasn't able to do this stuff. So I realized that the whole thing is based on coercion, and that's by and large the society that we're living in. So it's very interesting stuff when you start to awaken and realize this, and start to realize how important it is to take this kind of action and understand this stuff. There's actually an old saying in an ancient sacred writing that says, you will know the truth, and the truth is what will set you free. So it can be painful and scary, but if you take action from it, this can be the thing that can actually get you set up, get you ready, and get you ready to move forward. So obviously it's not a one webinar thing that will change your life, but I'm hoping today it will give enough to realize that in the coming weeks, in the more specific webinars that we do and other stuff, that we will actually, that you'll be able to find a way through this. And today I was actually sitting with, a guy who I've met through my dance group, and we were talking ages about stuff. And I even said to him that my vision was to create the best free education sovereignty in the world, that 99% of our clients will never pay us a cent, and getting through it. And then those who do will more than make up for it. So there's a difference between lawful and legal, and knowing this can free you from the outrageous requirements. And I've done everything from marry people at common law, and I'm not a licensed marriage celebrant, all kinds of stuff. You actually realize that a license is permission to break the law. So in other words, I don't know anywhere at common law where getting married is illegal. So to me, if people choose to participate in that system, that's really up to them. Lawful, according to Bastiat in his book, The Law, explains that lawful means, for example, the government might pass a law in China, like they once did, saying if you got more than one child, you have to get rid of the rest of them. That may be legal, but it's absolutely unlawful to order the killing of children. That's obviously unlawful. Charging, say, 76% tax, like the French government did at one stage, may be legal, but it's certainly not lawful. And so I remember at the time explaining this to my sons in the COVID. I said, it may be legal to basically coerce vaccines on businesses, but it's not lawful. So I said, it's just crap. I said, don't listen to any of that nonsense. And it may be legal to say you got to wear masks, but no, you can't force people to bloody put shit on their face where they can't breathe properly. So I said, don't put up with this for a minute. And doesn't mean we don't be wise about it, but ultimately being lawful is very different to legal. So I always ask this question about anything. Is it lawful? So for example, me not beating someone up so I'm upset at them, that's actually lawful as well as legal. The right thing to do is not to do that, beat someone up just for the sake of it, or to steal your money. It wouldn't be lawful for me to break my word to you on a particular business deal when I promised to do the right thing. Some government laws are good laws because they're lawful and they align with the common law. That's why I get always happy when I see laws coming in about cracking down more on crime and violent crime. I think that's a good example of lawful stuff. So understanding this will change your life. It changed my life when I learned this stuff. I started to realize there was a way through the system, which I was able to start to do. So this is one of my favorite ones to follow on from that. And I learned this from a guy in the sovereignty movement that I was in 20 years ago, who used to be very high up in the secret agent kind of area. And when you go back and actually learn about ancient laws and some of the greatest history of England, God, some of the stuff, I could keep you here for 5 hours. And I have done previous webinars where I've taught him this stuff, but when you understand the history of England and Australia and all that, you will actually see the knowledge of the power of some of our ancestors and why we got our blooming rights in the first place, which we're now giving up so easily, because these people knew this. John Calvin, the biggest fear of the English, of the government, King James and others, was Calvin actually openly told his followers that we will honour the laws of our government, but as soon as they disobey God's higher law, you are duty bound to disobey them. And the Geneva Bible and the original Bible taught that to their citizens. It was a very empowering book and brought in the Reformation in the 1500s. So, of course, when King James came in, and it's quite ironic, the first thing they actually did was bring in a very accurate Bible, but without Calvin's notes, telling people to rebel against ungodly governments. So it's interesting that when you read the ancestors' histories and people learn the truth does set you free. And that's the fact that God, that we're all created under Almighty God, the Creator. the ancient societies always believed in monotheism, which means an almighty creator. Now, I'm saying that, I'm not saying like Christian or Hindu. In fact, I love the Bhagavad Gita. I'm about to start teaching on that, the great Hindu teaching on the war between good and evil in India. I love the Bible. I love the Buddhist teachings. I like I read the Book of Mormon some years ago, and I love the book. I read just about any sacred holy book, and all of them come back to one creator, and the fact that that one creator manifests in various forms, and the one becomes the many, and the many become the one. And our forefathers knew that. And when you know that and you have that sovereignty, you become sovereignly responsible. So I'm responsible. So, for example, the fact that I have the ability not to pay taxes, I choose to contribute. If I legally set up foundations or whatever, I then make sure I philanthropically contribute back to society by lots of free webinars, lots of free gifts, giving to people all the time, making sure that I'm contributing in other ways, and things like that. So Nadine asked about teaching some of the underground teachings. Oh, you bet. You couldn't stop me doing it if you tried. I'm very keen to start teaching this kind of stuff now. I feel people are more ready. And remember, we create governments. Governments don't create us. We create governments. So it's like the tail wagging the dog. And when you realize this, you realize that it's we who create the fucking government, not the other way around. So, and then the government then creates these all capital slave bitches that basically then create you in a state of fear. And that's why one of my favorite little things I often give people is, of course, my tax or wealth matrix, so to speak, where I actually show this particular fact that the elite know really, 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 really well, exceptionally clever, and know exactly how the whole thing kind of works, so to speak. They know this thing called the wealth matrix, which is really quite straightforward. So the wealth matrix, what you see here is, the elite here know that the more money you make, the less tax you pay, because you can pay a crap load of money to people like, you know, great tax accountants, advisors, and experts to pay no tax, use philanthropy to give, look after these people down here, and then the bitches in here pay all the taxes. And that's by and large how the system actually works. And these people are the most frustrated people because they're like, they know all this, they work this out, and they're like, how the fuck do I get from here to here? And that's kind of what we teach at the club. You know, we really want to help people make that transition from there into there. Or even if they don't quite necessarily have the same wealth as they have, at least thinking and living as if it's being done. So that's by and large how the matrix actually works, so to speak. It's really quite simple, as most things actually are. So that then takes you even further. And one of the great things I learned in the underground movement, which really excited me, is how public servants are enslaved to their masters, which is the public. So in other words, I remember one of my mentors once said to me, "What's a public servant, Warren?" I said, "Yeah, they serve the public." So I said, "Okay, so who's their master?" And I said, "Oh, shit, me." He goes, "Yeah, you're the public, you're their master." So he said, "Remember that every time you deal with a government official, they are your servants." I can remember when the tax office audited me, I just kept thinking, well, these guys work for me. They're going to give me some guidance on how to improve my business and get more organized. And that's actually what ended up happening. I even got them to go ahead, organize my files. We talked, we got on really well, and things like that. So you start to realize that that the police, that everyone else, they are servants to the public. And once you realize the state of empowerment, you can deal with any government official without fear. Now, what you've got to understand today is how much this is in the mental realm. Many people learn these principles and go, "Oh, yes, yes, yes," and run out. But if deep down you're scared shitless of this kind of stuff and you still think like a slave, all you'll do is get yourself into trouble. So it's very important that you listen. If it's all new for you, you embrace, you take on board, you absorb, and you keep repetition and regularity. You know, keep coming, listening to these kind of webinars, re-listening to this, going into it, understanding, getting training in your common law rights and your empowerment, and keep learning it, because it's the truth and knowledge that sets you free. And there's a scripture in the Holy Bible that says, "My people are enslaved through ignorance and lack of knowledge." People get sick and stay sick because of lack of knowledge. People got vaccinated because of lack of knowledge. You know, people went because they lacked knowledge and they were terrified that one day they couldn't travel, live in a non-existent future, and went ahead and did it. I remember saying at the time, I said, number one, it's not lawful. And in any event, these things always end. And I said, I will be traveling and doing all the shit that I want to be doing when I'm ready to do it. And that's actually the truth of empowerment. You know, governments can only do so much for so long and get away with it. And the more you actually understand that, the more you start to really find your power and know who you really are and move beyond fear. That's why it says in one holy book that the perfect love casts out fears. One of the things I explained this to my kids about a while ago, I said to them, once you understand that it's not actually the Rockefellers and that who completely control the world, they're like the implementers, but it's the religious, spiritual Satanists behind these guys who control the world. It's the Council of Seven. It took me years to find this out, by the way, the Black Pope and various others, and you understand the Reformation and how the Reformation changed society, ended the dark age of the 50 that happened, where people being burned at stakes for being witches and shit like that. And where in the dark ages, for example, you couldn't even have a Bible or holy book on the table without the church's permission and training. And if you did, you would get basically burnt at the stake and set on fire and made into a barbecue. And that ended because people got empowered, the holy books got released out of there. And so the Catholic Church went underground, created the Jesuit movement and worked in the background and slowly got themselves back in there. So you've got to realize that that's why there's all kinds of weird restrictions around this and trying to get you to eat insects and kind of do all kinds of weird shit, and going like you couldn't dance and couldn't sing and couldn't do this kind of stuff. So when you understand this, and this is something that I found it was common, that every single major underground movement activists that I met and people who've been very high up in governments, without fail, all of them said, you've got to understand the power of the Catholics and that our whole legal system is created based on the King James Bible. And when you understand that, it becomes a whole lot easier. That was one of the first things that they actually told me. And I remember when I went to the Masonic Lodge for their open day, because I was told that the Masons use the Bible as their whole main book. And I was like, yeah, surely not. And I saw them with a big King James Bible sitting there. And I asked them in the open day openly, and they said they did. I questioned them on stuff, and they hastily stopped the meeting and closed it and closed the open day. So it was quite funny. But the true, controllers are religious, and it's not who you think you are. So in other words, you control the energy of the planet, you control the people. That's one of the things to realize and take on board. If you don't believe me, go and study quantum physics and science. Quantum, they found now that everything that happens in the physical comes first from the impression of the conscious mind, of the consciousness of the individual, and then also the collective mass consciousness. There's plenty of studies on this independently of me. So these guys know if they can control the consciousness, they can control the planet and control what people are doing. So I remember when I first found this out and started doing work to counteract them, I had the most crazy experiences, and I won't go into today, but spiritual experiences, waking up and having all kinds of weird shit happening, and I won't go into too much to this webinar, but weird shit, stuff that was so crazy. I actually go laughing, going, can't believe it. This is real, discovering how various groups in the secret societies and the Masonic Lodge and various others control government. Met a guy who was high up in the Masonic movement who actually, we became friends because I helped him out with some of his business, and he admitted to me everything that you hear on the net's by and large true. We do control society, we do control the energy, and we do control the law courts, and all kinds of other stuff. So we are living in this thing, and there's no question that bar a very radical inner awakening and people stepping up and finding their power, we're heading for some pretty shitty times and ahead of us. And I certainly want to do whatever the fuck I can to mitigate and see at least a strong enough movement that will basically say, no. So the extent it will come in can be limited. And so I remember when I was very fortunate because I grew up in the church. I was a lover of the Holy Bible because I was fortunate enough to learn from young about the truth of the Bible, and that nearly all the translations were basically shit and they'd been altered and doctored back in the 1970s when they created a translation committee to diminish the power, exactly like the Catholics did in the Dark Age. And I knew that, only the King James Bible or the Geneva was close to the truth. So I was actually able to study it and learn it. And once I started using it in the legal system and in my notices, I was amazed how effective it was. And even people who didn't even like the church, didn't even like, Christians or Muslims or anyone, were actually using the Bible teaching in these seminars. And I started practicing them and doing it and going, fuck, man, this works. And it does. So once you start to get control of the energy and learn that kind of stuff, you can do almost anything. So again, this is a whole separate thing I do in our mystery school, which I run behind the scenes. But took me a long time and many, many years to get that kind of stuff and learn this. But this is a good starting point to start to realize the empowerment, and the whole system is a big scam. And once you accept that as truth and start to find who you are, you can slowly start to get dominion and mastery over the system. So again, I remember seeing the 1907 encyclopedias and seeing the 1914 after the Rothschilds and Rockefellers bought into them, and was in complete shock as I saw whole sections of history being deleted. And I was just like, this is just like crazy, man, crazy shit. So that's kind of what we're doing. Yes, mate, I have a mystery school, but there's only like literally a few people in it, so not very many. Because it's pretty out there. So it's possible to escape the system if you prepare now and see the need for spiritual. So keep in mind, keep in mind that as I mentioned here, when you understand how the system actually works. So that is really, 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 really important. So when you get this, I showed you this diagram before. I mean, many people trying to solve a government problem are going all out in that, but they're not solving these two problems here. So if you're basically trying to run around protesting and doing all kinds of marches and throw flags at, Parliament House, and you don't deal with this shit in the background here, you're wasting your time, and all you're going to do is get yourself into trouble. So that's why I spent a lot of my time mastering financial sovereignty, because it's really important, getting yourself out of the rat race, getting yourself from that, and also mastering spiritual sovereignty to regain control of your energy and your mind. So there's a great scripture in the Holy Bible where in Revelation, which is a great book, if you really want to read a really good book that was written by a guy long time ago that's like eerily predicted what we're seeing now. He says, Babylon the Great is fallen. And when you study the history of what Babylon was, the whole system we're in today, economically, mortgage, control, mandates, all came out of Hammurabi's Babylonian law. So that's why John the Apostle here refers to Babylon the Great. It's fallen, become the habitation of devil. And then he says a very interesting things here. He says, come out of her, my people, that you be not partakers of her sins, and that you receive not of her plagues. In other words, get the fuck out of that system before you basically go downward. That's basically what it's saying. And you even go further through that particular thing, and it talks about the great riches coming to naught. It talks about everything collapsing as you know it, and the whole thing ending and changing. And I remember that years ago, when I first got involved in these underground movements, I can remember meeting a guy who actually gave me, we were doing some meditation, and we actually got given this particular scripture. And I remember the excitement that we got, and that was when we started finding out all this stuff, when we got this particular message given to us. The part, go out of this Babylon system, don't touch it, get yourself out of it, and let yourself be let out, for you will be protected. So I made this my mantra, but I'll always have the Lord go before me. In other words, the higher energies and frequencies go before me, and nothing can get near me. Nothing can touch me. And that's kind of why people say to me, when you do these webinars, aren't you afraid of being a target? I'm like, nope. I said, because this is what I rely on. I said, I rely on the order of creation, that God is higher than me, and I'm higher than government. So as long as I've submitted to common law, and I live in that faith and that belief, I'm pretty much untouchable. And that's been my mantra, and it's amazing, you basically get what you speak out and what you believe. And so I'm saying that for no other reason than saying this is the kind of level that you want to get to, or to start to work to take over what's coming. Because I'm telling you, you all saw what happened with bloody COVID, and how the shock and the horror of how literally government took rights everywhere and got away with it. Let's face it, they completely got away with it, and now know that they can bring in whatever they're bringing in next pretty much without impunity, while everyone's still whinging about what happened with COVID. So you've got to make sure you start to prepare on all levels if you want to be sovereign. You can't just go, hey, let's set up a structure or two, or let's just kind of, do this. You've got to prepare your whole way of thinking. You've got to change how you think. You've got to escape the trap of materialism, the rat race, the consumerism. You've got to start to change how you see energy. Stop being so, I don't like, I don't go to most churches, but I got my own religion and own spiritual belief. You've got to have your own need for a spiritual or religious or higher moral code of some kind, and be part of that, or and master energy. All very, very important. So now the next stage is, let's just look at the 6 legal loopholes that I use and summarize from there. So the first one is knowing the difference between legal and lawful. So ask that question, is it lawful? So I would always ask that when the mask mandate came out, is it lawful? Now, in asking that question, the first thing I did was actually talk to doctors I knew who are awake and ask if masks actually really work. And everyone who I trusted said, we haven't used them for years because they don't work. They did tell me that face shields do work in really dangerous environments, but masks don't. So, for example, when I went to Murdoch Hospital to see someone right in the middle, I refused a mask, but I happily wore a face shield because number one, I could breathe, and number two, I knew they actually worked. So I was actually happy under common law being sovereign to wear a face shield because I knew that would make everyone feel happier, and I felt comfortable because that was that felt good. That was the one time I pretty much did it. Otherwise, no, it's not legal. It's maybe legal, but it's not lawful. I mean, it stands for obvious reason that mandate things around vaccines even for private businesses. It's not it may be legal, but very, very unlawful. So that's what you want to ask yourself with every government law that comes in. Now, in saying that doesn't mean you run out and then go and put up a protest banner and burn a flag at Parliament House. I always then ask myself, what's the economic implications, what's the spiritual, and what's the political? And I address something on all three levels. I then got busy looking at the mask mandates. I looked into it, found a way to get exemption. And I also went through and did what I call my spiritual energetic intentions. I created intentions. I started visualizing myself walking right through it unharmed and things like that, and making sure that my economics were in place and I wasn't economically vulnerable to coercion from the government and things like that. So knowing the difference between legal and lawful is really important. The other one is always say to yourself when you've got a government one that they're the public servant and you are their master. That's the other thing. So make that kind of your mantra, like who's the master? Me, and again, I emphasize it doesn't mean you go and do anything silly, but you are the master. They are the servants. And when you get that, you go, and you would be amazed what starts happening and how they treat you. To me, I'm a master in the fact that I've got staff who work for me and I treat my staff well. So obviously I want to treat my staff well. I want to treat my servants well. So when I see the police, I'm very courteous with them. When I get pulled over for RBTs, I actually thank them because I don't really want drunk drivers who are literally pissed off their heads driving on the roads. I said, look, thanks guys, no problem. Very friendly. If I overstep their mark, then that's like an employee overstepping their mark. So then I've got to kind of discipline them and make sure that, okay, guys, you've overstepped your mark. So once they start saying to me, you're going to have to kind of get this like experimental needle, I'm like, well, hang on a sec. Now you're overstepping your mark. You're starting to be the tail wagging the dog here. So you can see it's a whole new way of thinking here. And masters, generally, you want to be good to your servants. It's under common law, treat your employees well, treat your servants well. So for me, my public servants, I want to make sure they're looked after and relatively happy, because if they're happy, they'll hopefully manage our state a little bit better and make life a little bit better for us here. The third thing is the 10 maxims of commercial law, especially the rule of consent. So very interesting when you study this. Howard Freeman talked about this in his Uniform Commercial Code. The whole system of commercial law that we're in is run by this thing called the Uniform Commercial Code. So one of the rules is that consent is, you can't make someone perform something without consent. That's one of the rules, that there has to be agreement or consent before you perform. So if you actually study the Income Tax Act, it's absolutely funny. You actually find out that there's nowhere in the legislation that you actually requires you to pay taxes. But the moment you consent to being a taxpayer or filling out forms, you then are one. And then, of course, if you've got enough coercion and everyone believing in it, it's a bit like trying to be the odd man or odd woman out in the schoolyard, when the boys are running the show. But understand that most of what you see is actually consensual. The elite know this very well. Most people know this very well. And I find just about every law I ever read is always a way through it. Even the new West Australia state of emergency laws that they're bringing in, like the permanent laws and the discrimination things, where they're trying to say that if you're running a religious school, that you have to kind of bring on whoever they say you can bring on, which is like, it's mind-boggling, that people can't make their choices. But when you actually read it, the laws in WA, they're saying we're not going to actually apply them to ones that don't rely on our funding. And I had a bit of a chuckle. So basically, it's kind of saying if you're willing to be sovereign, we'll leave you alone. Now, I've actually said for a while to people that if you actually are sovereign, WA is a damn good place to be. If you're in any way not sovereign or reliant on the government support, you are absolutely screwed. So WA, for those who live here, you are in a great possibility to become sovereign. You really do. It's a good state to be sovereign, a terrible state to not be sovereign. So the 10 maxims of commercial law, and another one that comes out of the commercial law in the 10 maxims is the pen is mightier than the sword. So this is why the way that credit card companies and banks go after you is through legal notices, through legislation, through mandates. And I mean, think about how scared everyone was when mandates were hitting. Just someone sitting there with a pen, writing up and putting out a mandate. So the pen is mightier than the sword. So in other words, they're not the only one who can do legal notices. I'm regularly doing legal notices on people and on situations. I found as soon as you do legal notices, they treat you very, very differently. I would do it with schools. I do it on bullying. I would do it on stuff like that. If your kid's being bullied, put a legal notice giving them 24 hours to resolve the issue in the school, or it's going to be taken that they're now fully aware the bullying's going on and they're liable from that point on financially and economically for any further or future harm to your child. Now, rest assured, you watch how fast they will move to fix the issue. I have done stuff like that. The pen is mightier. When I have clients start to try one in our company, I just use the legal notice because I know that legally you put the things in place, you're putting your weapons and putting things in position. I was planning all that with COVID. That's why I made sure I got my mask exemption. I got all my written exemption. I got everything in writing. I got things put in place. So in this society you live in, if you're in Australia, US or whatever, you need to get really good at knowing that your best sword is the pen, when you're at war. The pen is mightier than the sword. This is why I often read the Bible and I read the Bhagavad Gita and I actually speak it because I know that the written words is very powerful. There's an ancient saying in the Bible, in the beginning was the Word and the Word was with God and the Word was God. In other words, the Word manifests things in the physical. God said, let there be light and there was light. So when you speak things like that, so when I start reading the legal rights in the scripture, and my sons often do this, and we read them over ourselves, it's amazing how you start to believe it and start to live it. So the pen, using that in every area. If someone gives you a promise, make sure they put it in writing, make sure you do it in writing. Get used to using the sword, so to speak. The truth about money. The reason that most people got absolutely, fucked over by COVID was because their complete dependence on the monetary system, on the cash system, on the government system, on the licenses that governments say you could learn. I remember a good friend of mine who was a psychologist getting mandated and coming to me very scared. And I just pissed myself laughing and said, you Wally. I said, you're just believing the illusion, because they said that word psychologist. Just change your name. Just call yourself an integrative, holistic, universe parallel specialist, just make up some silly name and just keep going. And he pissed himself laughing and he said, yeah. And then he said, oh, the only thing is I can't get Medicare. And I said, yeah, and that's because you are relying on the government system for your financial support. So I said, that's how they're getting you. So I said, this is why you got to get sovereign financially. You do not want to be depending on governments. You do not want to be depending because if someone controls your money, they control you. And realize that even money, the cash dollars that you see, they're not money. It's only money because you believe it to be. Rest assured, if we see hyperinflation and they're worth next to nothing, it'll get cancelled very quickly. Money is only money when you believe it to be real. So there's many ways you can do money, as people have found with cryptocurrencies. You can do barter. You can do things like that. There's so many ways, to learn the truth, to actually do that. And these are all webinars in themselves. I'm sure you would agree. I just want to raise the issues for today. And you actually start to realize that. And then you go, well, yeah, there's a way to do this. There's always a way. And the other rule I do, my final one, is the Neo and Morpheus Principle. And that's operating, the more you can operate from outside the system, the better things could actually be. So, for example, whenever I'm dealing with the census or dealing with voting or dealing with anything, I'm operating, as I see it, outside the system. And what that also means, though, is many people then try and function completely outside it, whereas what I do is like Neo Morpheus would regularly plug into the matrix. Yeah, I plug into the matrix by, setting up structures for people. I use structures for myself. I operate in a financial system, but I also have my life and my sovereign world outside the system, That's why we talk about things like invisible world nest eggs, or just basically finding ways to operate, or the mystery schools where you operate in other realms outside of it. You start to learn to find ways to operate independently outside of it. So if the whole system collapses in front of you, it's just not going to affect you. And you can do that when you start to actually realize that you no longer, that everything ends eventually, and things like that. So, things like that. So, yeah, I mean, Natalie says about the International Health Guild you can join if health professional and want to work in private. Look, I think like Uber took over from taxis. I see a new health board will come in, eventually you'll see that will just kind of become a whole independent thing, because APRA is just a private kind of company, really. That's all it is. And everyone's learned to live under it because they believe they have to be licensed. It's like a good example for that is marriage licenses. Like, oh, you got to become a licensed celebrant. Now, yeah, someone's making some good cash out of doing that. So I remember when I was running a church years ago, and this couple asked me, will you marry us? I said, yeah, no problem. So I just did the marriage ceremony and married them under common law, because basically I didn't need anyone's license to tell me I could do that. So it's just learning to stay outside the language and be smart. So for example, getting financial services license. Well, yeah, it says you got to give specific advice or financial advice. So I'm like, well, I don't want to give advice. I want to empower people. I want to educate people. So bingo, I'm outside the system. So as much as possible, you want to learn to operate outside the system. And if you do get wealth, get real wealth. Like, yes, just keep in mind that when you talk about getting, money, like gold is a real physical asset, for example. Just keep in mind with gold, for example, that Roosevelt seized all the gold in 1933. There's every chance they'll do it again. So that's why, covering for that risk, going offshore and being able to do that and things like that. The other thing I was explaining to people today is that you don't actually own your property fully in Australia, because you've got what's called freehold, not allodial, which means you've only got a right over against every other citizen, but governments can take it if they want to. That's basically how the property right system works. So it's really important to start to get really educated and get empowered if you're going to get through what's going to be coming up ahead. So really, I've covered quite a bit today, and I've gone at breakneck speed, because I wanted to give as much as I could today. Okay, so just describe in maybe a word or two how you're feeling, like inspired, like blown away, exhausted, like what the fuck, and just, ask any questions, what your greatest learnings and things like that from today. Yeah, so Scott, excited to have someone teach. Thank you. No, thanks, Scott. That's great. Michelle, took myself off private health, and when the jab was mandated, lost clients. The jab is no longer mandated. Interesting. Glad I held out. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Gail, mindset is the key. Daniel, inner attitude. Kayla, if you cannot pay your mortgage, holding on to debt-based system. Yeah, look, I've done everything I can to get myself out of that system. Generally every 90 to 100 years, the Cheetah mortgage system collapses. 1933 was the last time, so we're definitely heading for it again. So Jasmine, about the power of the mind. Yep, couldn't agree more. And serving the future. Miko, always enlightening. Thank you. Natalie, it's already happening. Private banks on the way. People forming local government, all that kind of stuff. So many exciting things on the way. Yeah, absolutely. There's many who are doing their part, Natalie, in what I call in this work. So Ajani was showing information. Jonathan getting a payout. Yeah, I can't advise you on that, Jonathan, about drawing money out, cryptos and metals. You've really got to get educated on that and learn about balanced portfolios, what I would be suggesting. So having asked about appreciating the info by some. Nadine loves the lessons. That's great. I'm glad you're enjoying it. The general steps of sovereignty towards no tax payment. Yeah, look, that's a whole different thing in itself. It's just understanding the system and, kind of learning how the elite do it, exactly how they set up the system and what I call the philanthropic model. So, Proud about banding together and remove the government. Yeah, easier said than done. It's more about getting sovereignty enough first within yourself to be able to actually do that. So, Barbara, power of the mind, absolutely, yeah. Mental power is everything. Michaela, director ID, had to sign up. Yeah, look, the director ID is an interesting one. I'm probably going to do a webinar the next week or two. I'm being asked that so often. And the reality is I've chosen to avoid being a director as much as possible for that reason. It's very difficult to really avoid that because it's a government requirement. It's a government creation. They can make the rules. So apart from not being one or having offshore companies, there's not a lot you can really do apart from that, not that I'm aware of at the moment. So Angie talks about great to hear energy incorporated in the physical. Don't often hear this. Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, Electra found an exemption in Section 10 of the Public Health Act. Yep. Natalie, get paid by donation, not income. Oh, that's one way. It's that's definitely one way of doing it for sure. So getting paid by donations, that's why churches, for example, is a very effective way of doing it, and things like that, or foundations correctly structured legally, things like that. So yeah, well, look, anyway, we'll be doing more of these webinars over the coming weeks, definitely, because it's great that people like this, and I think it's good to show people the way through this. So thanks for coming, everyone. It's been a good hour now, so I'm going to say farewell, and I will see every one of you basically next time. Thanks for coming, and see you all next time. Bye for now.